called her too wild for any man, chained her like an animal, and sold her for $30. But the rancher who took her home had no idea she wasn't born to be owned. She was born to ride beside him into a war that would change the West forever. The sun over Monument Valley that day wasn't shining, it was bearing down like judgment. It carved the horizon into jagged red teeth and filled the air with a heat so heavy it pressed on a man's lungs. The auction yard simmered in that heat, a churn of dust, leather, and the sharp metallic clink of chains. Cattle bellowed in holding pens, mules stamped and snorted, and in between them on the splintered platform where goods were paraded for sale stood a human being shackled like freight. She was barefoot iron tight around her ankle wrists, bound in coarse rope. Her hair, wild red gold and sunshot, had been pulled into a rough braid that trailed down her back like the tail of some restless animal. The auctioneer's voice cracked with the strain of his own sales pitch, 6 foot in her bare feet. Strong as any 2 men I've met. Too wild, too strong. Too much trouble for the keeping. The crowd murmured, but it wasn't the kind of murmur a person wanted. This was the sound of folks sizing up a thing and finding it inconvenient. No one bid. Not because she wasn't worth something. Oh, she was worth plenty in muscle and stamina alone, but because the girl radiated the kind of quiet that made a man's stomach go uneasy. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even looking at the faces around her. Her chin was tucked low, her gaze somewhere near the dirt under her feet, until suddenly it wasn't. A shadow cut the sunlight overhead, a hawk gliding slow in a thermal, and her eyes followed it. It was the only time she moved. Her lips shaped a sentence no one heard, but the look in her face was enough to make the auctioneer shift his weight as though the ground beneath him had tilted. Samuel Merrick hadn't come here for this. He had ridden in from the north from a spread of land where the wind never seemed to stop talking, intending to buy nothing more controversial than fence wire and salt blocks. He stood near the edge of the yard, hat low against the glare, saying nothing, while others leaned in and speculated. The auctioneer cleared his throat, called the opening price. Silence. He lowered it. Still nothing. That was when Sam's hand rose quietly without ceremony. 30, he said. The laugh that rippled through the crowd was the kind that liked to bruise. A man near the front muttered, "Cheaper to buy a damn mule." The auctioneer tried again, scanning the faces for a competing bid. None came. And so, with a tone like he'd just been saddled with the responsibility of a bad bargain, he slammed the gavel. The rope was cut. The shackle opened with a reluctant creak. She stepped down from the platform, didn't thank him, didn't speak at all. She simply pulled on the scuffed boots someone had thrown at her feet and followed Sam out of the yard like she'd already decided where they were headed. They rode in silence, the land swallowing sound. Monument Valley rolled out around them in great red walls and empty spaces that could eat a man whole. The kind of place where a person's voice seemed small no matter how loud they shouted. When they reached the ranch, Sam swung down from his horse and gestured toward the low-slung bunkhouse. "You'll sleep there," he said. She nodded once, no questions asked. By dusk, she had scrubbed herself raw at the pump changed into the men's clothes he'd left hanging on the door, and braided her hair again. There was no fuss in her movements, no attempt to explain herself, no softening of that hard, quiet presence she carried like a second skin. The next morning, before the first light slid over the ridges, Sam found her already outside. Barefoot, in the frost-hardened dirt, she walked the corral fence, testing each post with a shove of her shoulder, as if memorizing the boundaries of the place. Days bled into one another. She worked without being told. She handled tools with the certainty of someone who knew what they were for, before she'd ever been shown. She moved cattle-mended saddles, split wood, hauled water. She could lift what most men could, and she did it without grunting. And then there was the horse. A young stallion, black wild-eyed, had been penned for weeks, untouchable. Sam had meant to trade him off. But one afternoon he saw her standing at the edge of the pen, hand resting on the top rail. She climbed in without a halter, without so much as a rope. The stallion snorted, pawed the dirt, ready to rear, but she just stood, letting the wind carry her scent, letting the dust swirl. Slowly she stepped forward. His ears flicked his head lowered, and when her palm touched the side of his neck, he went still. Sam didn't say anything, but later alone in the barn he realized something unsettling. For the first time in years since before his brother had died, the ranch didn't feel silent anymore. It wasn't the clatter of tools or the scrape of boots or even the snort of the horses. It was something less obvious, something he couldn't quite put his hands around. A shift in the air. A presence that without warning or invitation had filled the long empty spaces inside him. He didn't know then that trouble was already on its way, drawn to that presence like a wolf to fresh blood. He didn't know that buying her for $30 would turn his quiet, predictable life into a storm. But standing in the doorway of the barn, watching her braid her hair with calloused fingers and the patience of someone who had survived worse than loneliness, Sam Merrick knew one thing for certain. She hadn't come to his ranch to be owned. She had come to stand beside him. And whatever that meant, whatever it cost, the reckoning was coming. Snow still clung to the high ridges that morning, the kind that hides in the shadows long after winter's left the valleys. Sam had been checking the far pasture when he spotted it, an envelope nailed dead center to the barn door, the nail driven so deep it had split the wood. The handwriting was neat, careful, and the paper smelled faintly of cigar smoke. Samuel Merrick, the woman you have belongs to me. You will return her within 3 days. Edwin Harrow. Harrow. Sam had heard the name whispered in saloons from Gallup to Durango, a railroad baron from Silverton, Colorado. He had the kind of money that didn't just buy cattle or land, it bought judges, sheriffs, and entire towns. If Harrow wanted something, there weren't many people fool enough to tell him no. Sam set the letter on the kitchen table that night. Rowan read it once, her gray eyes steady, then slid it back toward him. He's not the first, she said. He won't be the last. She didn't raise her voice, didn't ask what he planned to do, but something in the way her fingers curled against the tabletop told him she was ready for whatever came. The first night passed without incident. The second it began. It started with a glint far off in the dark, the kind of gleam you catch just before a man strikes a match. Rowan saw it from the bunkhouse window. "We've got company," she said, as she stepped into the main house, already buttoning her coat. Sam grabbed his rifle from above the door. They stepped out into the brittle cold together, the air sharp enough to sting their throats. The moon hung low and hard, lighting the open yard in a pale wash. 6 riders approached from the south, their coats long and their rifles glinting when the light caught them. Rowan had spent the day setting out lanterns along the south fence, little traps of light meant to make an unfamiliar rider think the ranch yard lay farther west than it did. Sam wasn't sure they'd work until the riders split 3 peeling toward the false glow, while the other 3 came straight on. The first gunshot cracked the air like a frozen branch breaking. Sam dropped low and fired back the recoil sharp against his shoulder. One of the advancing riders swerved his horse, screaming as it stumbled into a drift. From the barn loft, Rowan's rifle barked, clean and precise. A man pitched sideways off his saddle into the dirt. The yard filled with smoke and the sour smell of spent powder. Horses reared and screamed, hooves tearing up the frozen ground. Sam caught movement to his left, a man slipping between the shadows toward the corral. He turned fired once and the man crumpled into the fence. By the time the echoes died, only 2 riders remained, galloping hard into the darkness, their silhouettes shrinking against the horizon. The yard was quiet except for the restless shifting of the stock. Then Sam saw the glow. It came from the barn, flickering gold through the slats. The far corner had gone up flames, licking along the dry boards like they'd been waiting years for the chance. Sam ran, but Rowan was faster. She dropped her rifle in the dirt and went straight into the smoke boots, pounding the frozen ground. He yelled after her, but she didn't slow. She disappeared into the dark mouth of the barn. Seconds later, she re-emerged, driving the horses before her, a lunge line coiled tight in one hand. Smoke clung to her hair, her face streaked with soot, but her eyes were sharp alive. Sam grabbed her arm as she passed. "You could have—" "I didn't." She cut in already, moving toward the corral with the panicked animals. They spent the next hour dousing the fire with what little water they had left in the pump barrel, the two of them working side by side until only charred timbers and steam remained. The south wall was gone, but the roof still held. Later, as they stood in the open yard, the cold pressing hard against their backs, Sam asked the question that had been clawing at him since the letter arrived. "Why you? What's Harrow want with you?" Rowan's gaze drifted past him to the far hills where the last of the riders had vanished. Some men collect horses, some collect gold. Harrow collects people. Not because he needs them, but because he likes to know he can take them. And you were one he couldn't keep. Her mouth twitched, not a smile, but close enough to feel dangerous. "I walked away. That's a thing men like him can't forgive." Sam looked at her, then really looked at the soot on her skin, the hair plastered to her cheek from sweat and smoke, the way her breath didn't shake, despite the cold and the fire they'd just come through. He understood in a way that had nothing to do with logic that the fight hadn't ended tonight. It had only changed shape. Harrow had sent men to take back what he thought was his. Sam had sent them running. That alone would be enough to make him come harder next time. But there was something else, something he hadn't put into words yet, that she wasn't just standing here because he'd bought her at some backwater auction. She was here because she'd chosen not to leave. And that meant, whether he liked it or not, her fight was now his. He didn't tell her that. He just nodded toward the bunkhouse. "Get some rest. We'll be up early." As they walked back through the dark steam still curling from the burned wall of the barn, Sam realized the stillness around them wasn't peace. It was the kind of quiet that comes just before the ground shakes. The kind that means someone out there is counting down the hours until they strike again. Only this time, he thought they wouldn't be met by a quiet rancher and a girl the world thought too wild to keep. They'd be met by something they hadn't prepared for two people who'd already decided the cost was worth paying. The moon was high when they left the valley behind. The trail to Taos wound through mesas that glowed silver under the cold light, each turn revealing another wall of stone that seemed older than memory. Sam rode ahead, his shoulders hunched against the wind, while Rowan followed in silence, her gaze sweeping the horizon like she expected trouble to step out from the shadows. They'd agreed, without saying it aloud, if they wanted this to end, they needed to cut out the root, not just swat at the branches. That root had a name, Edwin Harrow, and Harrow had a ledger. The house they sought sat on the edge of town, an adobe structure weathered by wind, and years its windows glowing faintly against the dark. Adela Cross opened the door before Sam could knock. She was small, wiry, with eyes that seemed to take in a room faster than most men could draw a gun. A pale scar ran down her cheek like a lightning strike. She didn't smile. "You're late," she said, stepping aside to let them in. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, so bitter it seemed carved from bark. Adela poured it without asking if they wanted any. Rowan took hers without flinching. Sam sipped once and decided it was less a drink and more a test of will. Adela had once worked for Harrow, keeping his books and managing his household before she'd had enough sense or enough luck to walk away. She didn't waste words. The ledger you're after is in his mansion in Silverton. He keeps it in a safe behind the blue curtain in his study. Heavy thing needs a crowbar or the right key. And don't fool yourself, it's not just a list of names, it's proof. Transactions, dates where the people went. Some sold to ranchers, some to miners. Some to worse places. Rowan leaned forward. Worse, Adela's eyes flicked to her then away. There's talk of an outfit calling itself the Vaughn Network. Harrow's just a spoke in their wheel. That ledger connects him to them. Take it, and you'll have more than just dirt on one man, you'll have a trail leading to something bigger. The fire popped in the hearth, and for a moment the only sound was the hiss of sap in the logs. Adela rose, crossed the room, and picked something off a high shelf. A wooden toy horse, its legs crudely carved, one ear chipped. She held it out to Rowan. This belonged to a boy I knew. Harrow's men took him 3 years ago. If that book tells me where he went, I'll see to it myself. Sam tucked the details away. He didn't promise anything. Promises got people killed, but he nodded once. I'll get it. The ride to Silverton was a blur of snow and shadow. The town lay folded into the mountains like it was trying to hide from its own past. Harrow's mansion stood on the hill above it, all polished wood and stone columns, the kind of place meant to remind folks who owned them. Sam waited for the snowstorm to crest before making his move. The wind carried enough white to blind a man at 10 paces, and the streets were empty except for the lamps swaying on their hooks. He slipped in through a side gate, scaling the fence with a quiet ease born of years mending his own. Inside, the house was warm and heavy with the smell of brandy. He moved through velvet and gold leaf, keeping to the edges until he found the blue curtain in the study. The safe was where Adela had said. Heavy iron, old but solid. Sam worked the pry bar slow, listening for the faintest shift in the tumblers. When it gave it, did so with a groan that made the hairs on his neck rise. He pulled the ledger free, a thick, leather-bound thing, the weight of it unsettling in his hands. Footsteps creaked on the stairs. He froze. A dog's nails clicked on the wood, the sound growing closer. He slid the ledger into his coat and slipped out through the side door, the dog barking once sharp, just as the snow swallowed him. By the time he rode back into Monument Valley, the storm had passed. The ranch lay still in the early light smoke curling from the chimney. He'd barely swung down from his horse when he saw the figure in the corral. A boy, no older than 12, collapsed against the fence, his clothes in tatters, his skin the color of ash. Rowan was already moving toward him. She lifted him as though he weighed nothing, carrying him inside without a word. For 3 days they nursed him, coaxing water past his cracked lips, feeding him broth, until the sharp angles of his bones seemed less desperate. On the 4th day he woke. His eyes went straight to Rowan, who was sitting in the corner mending a bridle. He stared for a long moment before speaking, his voice a rasp. "You're the tall one who doesn't bow." Rowan looked up, one brow raised. "And you are Eli," he said. He wouldn't say where he came from at first, only that he'd been running for days. But Sam saw the way his shoulders flinched at the sound of boots on wood, how his eyes tracked the shadows in the corners of the room. The ledger lay on the table between them, its pages filled with names and prices, some crossed out, some marked with a small, careful symbol that Sam didn't yet understand. Late that night, when the fire had burned low, Eli finally spoke again. "You're looking for Harrow, but Harrow's not the worst of it." Sam met Rowan's eyes across the table. She didn't speak, but there was something in her face like she'd heard this before, or at least feared it. Eli's voice was steady, too steady for someone his age. "There's something bigger. They call it the Vaughn Network. Harrow works for them, so did others. They take kids, make them into things they can use." He looked at Rowan then, and for the first time there was no awe in his gaze, only the sharp recognition of one survivor seeing another. "You know what I'm talking about, don't you?" Rowan didn't answer. She didn't need to. The wind that came off the mesas that night carried grit sharp enough to sting the eyes, but it wasn't the weather that kept Sam awake. Eli's words from the night before clung to him like the smell of smoke in a burned-out barn. The Vaughn network. Bigger than Harrow, deeper than anything Sam had ever gone up against. He didn't need the boy to spell out what make them into things they can use, meant Eli's scars spoke well enough. Rowan was already saddling the horses when he stepped out of the house. Her face was unreadable in the dim light, but her movements were deliberate, efficient. Eli stood nearby, clutching the strap of a small satchel like it was the last solid thing in the world. The forge lay in the Nevada desert, buried so deep in sand and rock that the wind almost swallowed the tracks leading to it. They rode at night, skirting known trails moving through arroyos and washes where the moonlight barely reached. By day, they found shelter in dry gullies under overhangs of rock where the air stayed cold and still. Rowan used the hours to teach Eli things he'd need if he was ever on his own again: how to read the wind for signs of water, how to move without drawing a shadow, how to tell when a rattler was close by, the change in the silence. The boy learned quickly, not out of eagerness, but because learning meant survival. On the fourth night, Eli guided them toward a flat expanse where the land looked unremarkable until you knew what to look for. There, almost hidden by the shifting dunes, stood a low structure of steel and concrete half swallowed by the earth. No lights showed on the surface, but Eli said there would be more below than anyone could imagine. The front doors were thick slabs of warped metal scarred, as if they'd once been blown inward and hastily repaired. Rowan pressed a hand to the cold steel, then drew back, eyes narrowing. "They've left it looking abandoned on purpose," she said. Sam didn't need convincing. Inside, the air was stale heavy with the ghost of bleach and something metallic that made the back of his throat itch. Their boots echoed in a way that told him the place was larger than it seemed. Just beyond the entrance, words were etched deep into the concrete wall. "Break the soul before you bend the bone." Eli stopped short when he saw it. His hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles went white. "They put that above every hallway," he whispered. They moved deeper, passing rooms lined with rusted bed frames, each fitted with leather straps darkened from years of use. In another room, glass cabinets held tools Sam didn't want to name. Rowan stopped in the middle of a corridor and stared through a thick pane of glass into a chamber where a girl sat strapped to a chair. She couldn't have been more than 9. Her skin was pale from lack of sun, and the corners of her mouth were stained purple from some kind of serum. Rowan was through the door before Sam could speak, her knife flashing as she cut the straps. The girl's eyes fluttered open, and she whispered, "You're not doctors." "No," Rowan said gently. "We're here to take you home." They found 3 more children in the lower levels, a boy whose back was a map of burns, another with thin wires stitched into his scalp, and one who wouldn't speak at all, his small hand locked around a tin soldier as if letting go meant vanishing. Eli knelt in front of each one, speaking softly, telling them it was safe. They listened to him in a way they wouldn't to anyone else. In the far wing, Sam found the heart of it, a long, narrow room, with shelves stacked high with metal headpieces, each one threaded through with copper and strange narrow tubing. The sight made his stomach twist. "Catalyst helmets," Eli said behind him. "They use them to break us down, to rewire." Rowan didn't wait for discussion. She took a sledgehammer from the corner and began smashing them one by one, the sound ringing out like a kind of reckoning. Sam joined her, and soon the room was nothing but shards and twisted wire. They gathered what evidence they could: ledgers, blueprints, photographs. Sam forced himself to look at each image to memorize what this place had done so there would be no doubt later. One folder stopped him cold, a profile marked Subject 17D Elijah. It listed every detail of Eli's life they had been able to extract, ending with the note marked for disposal. Resistance to conditioning too high. He closed the folder and put it in his coat. Eli didn't need to see it. When everything worth taking was packed, Sam set the charges along the support beams. The children were led out first, Rowan moving at their side, a hand on each small shoulder. They mounted the horses waiting in the shadows beyond the dune. Sam lit the fuse and didn't look back until they were half a mile away. The blast tore the desert silence apart. Flames licked high into the night, painting the dunes in gold and red. The children didn't cry. They watched eyes wide as the fire devoured the forge. Even the boy who hadn't spoken made a small sound, then something like relief breaking free after too long locked inside. They rode until dawn before stopping in a narrow canyon where the wind couldn't reach. Rowan settled the children with blankets and water, then sat down across from Sam. Her face was streaked with soot, her braid loose from the fight. This was one she said quietly. "There will be more." Sam nodded. "Then we burn them all." It wasn't said like a threat or a boast, it was a promise. Spring brought a false sense of peace to the valley. The snowmelt carved silver threads through the canyons, and the air smelled of sage and cedar. Sam and Rowan spent their days building what they called Emberfield, though it was little more than a collection of patched buildings, fences mended with whatever wood could be scavenged, and a corral large enough for the horses to run without feeling penned. It was meant to be a place where the rescued children could sleep without waking to chains or shouts. They learned to ride, to tend animals, to mend harness leather, and plant seeds in the thin soil. For the first time in months, laughter began to rise in the air again, tentative at first, then freer, like it had remembered the way back. But peace in this country was like water in your palm, never there for long. It was just past dawn when Sam heard it, a deep metallic grind that didn't belong to the wind or the earth. He stepped out to the ridge above the canyon, glassing the horizon, and saw it a black-armored train cutting through the land with the slow, sure movement of a predator that knew its prey couldn't escape. Stenciled on its side in paint, faded almost to nothing, were the words Vaughn Expedition 7. Rowan was already on the ridge when he lowered the spyglass. She didn't ask what it was. Her eyes were locked on the train, as if she'd felt its presence before she'd seen it. How many, she asked. Too many, Sam said. The train slowed as it reached the canyon floor, hissing steam. A single steel door slid open, and a woman stepped out. She wore a black coat cut sharp at the shoulders, boots polished to a shine, and a brimmed hat that shadowed her eyes. She carried no weapon in sight, but the way she moved said she didn't need one. "I know who you are," her voice carried unnaturally well across the gap. "And I know what you've taken." Sam didn't answer. "What we've built," she continued, "isn't slavery. It's salvation. You think you've rescued them, but you've stolen their future." Rowan's voice was low but steady when she called back, "You talk pretty for someone who forges chains." The woman's mouth curved, but it wasn't a smile. "And you speak well for an animal." The insult rolled off Rowan like rain off stone. She'd heard worse from men who thought their cruelty was power. She looked at Sam, and in that glance they agreed this wasn't going to end with words. Sam lit the signal flare. From beneath the train, the earth gave way with a roar. 2 days before, he had found the old miners' tunnels and packed them with the last of the quarry dynamite. The explosion tilted the front cars, twisting rails, sending soldiers spilling from the open doors. They came masked, armed, and silent, moving with the drilled precision of men who'd been taught not to question. Sam stayed high on the ridge rifle, tracking the fuel cars, while Rowan moved through the chaos below, a shadow in motion. She dropped one man with a thrown rock the size of a fist, disarmed another before he could bring his weapon up. Then the sound came, a heavy grinding howl that didn't belong to anything human. From the rear car stepped something plated in steel from shoulders to boots, its head enclosed in a helmet so thick it seemed part of its skull. It moved fast, impossibly fast, and in 2 strides it had its hand around Rowan's throat, lifting her off the ground and throwing her hard against the rocks. Sam fired twice, but the bullet sparked harmlessly against the armor. The thing turned toward him, but Rowan was already back on her feet. She hit it like a boulder rolling downhill, driving both of them into the dirt. The blows it landed should have broken her, but she took them, answering with her own until cracks spidered across the visor. She slammed her forehead into the mask once, twice again, until the metal gave way, and the face beneath was revealed not a monster, but a boy, barely grown, eyes wide and terrified, even in unconsciousness. Rowan let him fall. Sam had reached the woman in black by then. She hadn't moved during the fight, only watched with the detachment of someone appraising livestock. He leveled the rifle at her. "Vaughn doesn't end with me," she said calmly. "Good," Sam replied, then struck her across the face with the rifle's stock. They bound her hands and sent her east with a package, files, photographs, names, and a single message: burn every record, destroy every helmet, release every child, or we come back. By nightfall, the canyon was quiet. The train lay wrecked, smoke rising in thin spirals into the dark. The children huddled together near the fire, Eli sitting beside June, the 2 of them speaking in low tones. Even the boy, who rarely spoke now, whispered to one of the younger ones, pointing up at the stars. Sam sat on the porch of the main house, cleaning the rifle by lantern light. Rowan joined him, her coat-torn hair loose, hands still raw from the fight. For a long while they didn't speak, just listened to the sound of Emberfield breathing in the dark. "What if they come again?" she asked finally. "They will," he said. And then he looked at her, the lamplight catching the steel in her eyes. "Then we ride beside each other." For the first time since he'd met her, she smiled without a trace of caution. Not like a woman bracing for war, but like someone who'd found a place worth standing for. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage through the yard. Somewhere behind them, one of the children laughed high and sudden, as if the world outside the fence didn't exist. Sam let the sound settle into him. Peace wouldn't last, not here, not against men like Vaughn, but for tonight they had it, and that was enough to keep building. From the first moment Samuel Merrick saw her standing on that auction block in Monument Valley, barefoot, shackled and branded, too wild, too strong, for a man the course of his life shifted like a river breaking free of its banks. He hadn't gone looking for trouble, and he sure hadn't gone looking for her yet. $30 later, he found himself riding home with a stranger who refused to be anyone's property. Rowan Hale didn't plead, didn't explain herself, and didn't flinch. She simply worked day after day until the silence on Sam's ranch was no longer emptiness, but presence. The quiet didn't last. Edwin Harrow, a railroad baron with money and malice in equal measure, sent word claiming Rowan belonged to him. The threats turned into an attack on Sam's land, a night of gunfire and smoke, when Rowan proved she wasn't a prize to be kept, but a force to be reckoned with. Together they fought back, but Harrow's shadow stretched far beyond Silverton. In Taos, an old ally of Rowan's, Adela Cross told them about Harrow's ledger proof of human transactions that tied him to something worse. Sam rode into the heart of Harrow's mansion during a snowstorm, and came back with that book, its pages heavy with the names and fates of the sold. Among those pages lay a thread that pointed to the Vaughn network, a machine that didn't just trade in people, but reshaped them into obedient tools. That truth arrived at their doorstep in the form of Eli, a boy from Santa Fe, half starved and half dead, who spoke of forges where children were broken in body and will their instincts rewritten. He had escaped, but he hadn't left unscarred. Rowan recognized what he'd been through without having to say it aloud. The three of them rode into the Nevada desert, hunting one of these forges. By night, Rowan taught Eli the skills to survive. By dawn, they reached a bunker buried in sand, marked inside by the chilling words, "Break the soul before you bend the bone." They freed children from strapped beds and glass-walled rooms, smashed the catalyst helmets designed to erase selfhood, and carried away the blueprints and records. As the desert sky burned behind them, Rowan promised there were more forges to find and to destroy. Back home, Emberfield began to take shape. What started as Sam's ranch became a refuge where rescued children could learn to ride mend fences and feel safe again. But Vaughn was not the kind of enemy to let a wound heal without reopening it. The black armored train marked Vaughn Expedition 7 came into their canyon like a living threat. A woman in black emerged, speaking in the honeyed tone of someone who could justify any cruelty as necessary. Her soldiers poured from the train, and with them came an enhanced fighter plated in steel a boy turned into a weapon. The battle was fierce. Sam used the land, collapsing the rails with old dynamite. Rowan fought the steel-plated soldier until she shattered his mask and saw the boy underneath. They spared him. The woman in black was sent east in chains, carrying with her the evidence of Vaughn's crimes, and a warning, destroy it all, or they would come back. By the time the smoke cleared, Emberfield still stood. The children were still laughing in the corral. Sam and Rowan sat on the porch, knowing this peace would never be permanent. Yet, for the first time, Rowan smiled, not the guarded half-smile of someone bracing for loss, but the rare expression of someone who'd found a place worth defending. This was more than a story of rescues and gunfights. It was the long arc of two people who began as strangers in an uneven transaction, and became equals in a fight far larger than themselves. Sam learned that standing for something often means standing with someone even when the cost is steep. Rowan learned that not all bonds are chains. Some are the ties you choose, the ones forged in fire and kept in trust. The lessons here run deeper than the dust and the gunpowder. In a world that still tries to label people too much, too little, too wild, too broken, the truth is that those labels mean nothing compared to the choices we make when faced with cruelty. You don't need to be the loudest voice or the fastest draw. You need to be the one who stays when it matters, the one who sees another human being as more than the role they've been forced into. In our modern lives, the Vaughn network may not ride into town on armored trains, but systems of exploitation still exist, sometimes hidden in plain sight. The story of Sam and Rowan reminds us that the first step to dismantling them is to acknowledge they're there. The second step is to decide they will not stand unchallenged. That might mean protecting the vulnerable in your own community, standing up in the face of injustice at work, or refusing to let fear keep you from helping someone in danger. It's also a reminder that no one wins these battles alone. Sam could have tried to fight Harrow by himself. Rowan could have stayed on the run. Eli could have survived alone in the shadows. But it was only together, trusting each other's strengths, covering each other's weaknesses, that they managed to tear down 2 forges, save lives, and build something lasting. Emberfield, in the end, was more than a ranch. It was proof that survival doesn't have to be the end of the story. Healing, growth, and new beginnings can exist in the same place where pain once lived. That's not just a lesson for the Old West. It's a truth that belongs in every time and every place. So, as you carry this story with you, remember, strength is not in how hard you can hit, but in how fiercely you can protect. Freedom is not only the absence of chains, but the presence of a place and people you choose to stand beside. And justice is not a single act, but a relentless decision day after day to push back against those who profit from the suffering of others. If this journey through dust fire and defiance spoke to you, don't let it end here. There are more stories to tell, more lives to walk, beside more truths to uncover more battles worth fighting. Subscribe to the channel and help keep these stories alive. Your support gives us the fire to bring you the next tale from the wild edges of history, where every horizon holds another fight for freedom.